Well, hello YouTube. Hello from Philadelphia. I'm going to tell you a little story today. It's about something that I don't know if everybody knows exists in Philadelphia, at least not at this spot. And this is basically part one of a series I want to do on the Mason Dixon Line. So, all right. Now you can see I am currently here at the end of South Street, where South Street crosses over I-95 to the Delaware. Here, I'll show you the highway real quick. So, yeah, you know, in this part of the country, a lot of highways are built along rivers, right? And that's certainly what's happened here. But, you know, they've kindly still marked a very important place. That is where Mason and Dixon sort of began their measurement of what would become the Mason Dixon Line. And I don't think people realize that it sort of started here at the end of South Street in Philadelphia. So I wanted to show it to you today. And this is going to be a little bit of an introduction. I'm not going to tell the whole story because I want to actually go and visit more of the Mason Dixon Line places and show them to you in more detail. So my goal with this video is really just to introduce you to the story and show you this spot, and then I have another secret spot that we're gonna walk to. And at the end of this video, if you stick around, you'll get to see something that I'm pretty sure almost no one knows is right here in Center City in Philadelphia. So stick around to the end. Now, our story sort of begins with this word right here, southernmost. It's a question, you know. Back in the day, Philadelphia's borders were set by William Penn, and when he you know, was given his charter for Philadelphia, he set the border. The southern border as South Street. So South Street is called South Street because it was the southernmost border. I think it used to have a different name, actually, but that's why it's there. So now I'm going to tell this story a little out of order. You know, the question is why start right there at South Street? Why did Mason and Dixon do it there? And the reason is kind of long, kind of complicated, but essentially, you know, they had to make a measurement to settle a land dispute between William Penn, who, as you might know, was the governor of Pennsylvania and the founder of Pennsylvania. He had a land dispute with Lord Baltimore, who was the governor of Maryland. Lord Baltimore, you know, down south, they didn't like where the borders were drawn, and they got into a little tiff. Okay, so how did this happen? We got to back up quite a bit to before William Penn, before Philadelphia was even a twinkle in his eye, and before even New Sweden was founded down in Tinicum. And we actually have to go back even before, I believe, even before the Mayflower, or maybe not the Mayflower, or at least before like Boston and some of the really early, like Jamestown, some of the really early settlements. That's sort of the time period we're talking. I think like 1610, 1620. And at that time, there really weren't there wasn't anyone around here from the old world. Of course, there were the Lenape. The Lenape lived in Philly. They had a town here, but no Westerners, no Europeans had come over. And the first guy that came over to really explore this part of the Delaware Valley and this part of America was John Smith. And you may recognize John Smith from the Pocahontas story. It's the same guy. John Smith, he came over, I believe it's like 1610. I think that's kind of the time period he was walking around here. And he explored this area, and he made one of the first maps of Delaware, of the Delaware, which maybe we'll take a pause right now, and I'll put it in right now. All right, so, you know, this brings us to, now that you've seen the map, this brings us to one of the main questions about why I'm telling this story today. One of the main reasons I'm telling you this story today is that today in Philly is a big day. It's the Super Bowl, and we're in it. So, you know, we're gonna be measuring some yards today. We're gonna be measuring some touchdowns. We're gonna be measuring some downs, some passes, some yardage, right? And the thing is, sorry to say, sadly, but Philly is pretty bad at measuring stuff sometimes. At least we started off on the wrong foot as a city in some sense, because coming back to John Smith, when he made his map of this area, he didn't have a good way of measuring. Like science wasn't as advanced as it is now. There was sort of, I think, there's sort of still figuring out navigation, and this part of the world had not been mapped. So when John Smith made his map, he drew some lines wrong. He got it wrong, which in Philly, we need to make sure that today we don't do. We need to make sure that today we don't give Mahomes an inch he doesn't deserve, and we need to take every inch that they give us. So, you know, let's not do what John Smith did today. Let's do the opposite and actually get our measurements right? Go Birds. All right, so what did John Smith get wrong, right? What did he measure incorrectly when he was making his map? There is a latitude line. Now, if you know longitude and latitude, you know that latitudes go horizontally, right? And so, if you noticed on the sign, the sign mentioned latitude, and the specific latitude line in question. Hey, Letty, what's up, man? Or Telly, right? Are you Telly? No, you look like someone I know. Take care, man. Go Birds. Okay. All right. Let me start that over, I guess. All right. So, yeah, the horizontal latitude that John Smith marked on his map to around this area was the 40th parallel, 40th latitude line. And so he put the 40th parallel line on his map, and when he went back to England, the king used John Smith's map as a way of doling out land. So when the king, you know, was doling out land, William Penn, I think Penn's father was a war hero or something, and the king owed his son William Penn some land as a, you know, wanted to give it to him as a, even though William Penn was not a nobleman, you know, Lord Baltimore in Maryland, he was a nobleman, right? He deserved Maryland, and he deserved. So, but you know, William Penn was just a commoner. So there's a little bit of a dynamic in this story going on there too, where, you know, so when the king gave William Penn land here, he said they agreed the border of Pennsylvania should be the 40th parallel on the map that John Smith made, right? But of course, John Smith had messed it up. He put the 40th latitude much farther south than it actually was. Okay, so this is where the whole dispute started. It was with John Smith's map in 1610, and using the 40th parallel as a way of marking the southern border of Pennsylvania. And here's the thing, they didn't really have good ways of measuring stuff back then. So for a long time, that mistake on that map went unrecognized. Like, I don't know how exactly it happened, but for a long time, long enough that William Penn sailed across the ocean and showed up here. He still believed that they still believed that the 40th parallel was much farther south than it is. They thought the 40th parallel was intersecting the Chesapeake down near where Baltimore is now. But essentially, the southern border, William Penn wanted the southern border to intersect with the Chesapeake because that would give him access to the ocean. So, one second. So, having access to the ocean is a huge deal for a colony, right? Otherwise, obviously the Delaware is a deep water port, so that was good, and it remains a deep water port, although it's deep water all the way up to Philly's port. So that's good. It gave access to the ocean that way, but the Chesapeake would have been really good for William Penn to have access to as well. And Lord Baltimore didn't like that, right? So Lord Baltimore shows up. And he's sort of the first guy to be like, hey, I think you got the map wrong. I think the 40th parallel is actually way farther north than Philly. And unfortunately, by that time that he mentioned this, William Penn had already shown up, and he'd already founded Philly and started his colony and sent Quakers out into the countryside. And the New Sweden had already sort of established some settlements here that William Penn took over. So this was a big problem. I mean, Philadelphia was William Penn's home. It was his flagship capital of his colony. So it mattered that this border was not above Philly. If you look at the map, and maybe I'll be able to share another map about this, but you can look at the map of the 40th parallel, and it's clearly north of Philly, like very clearly. It intersects somewhere north, like in northeast Philly, like far northeast Philly, maybe even up in somewhere in Bucks County, essentially. So, that wasn't good, because that meant that Philadelphia, if they followed the actual, what the king said was that Pennsylvania ended at the 40th parallel, which means that technically Philadelphia should have been part of Maryland, not part of Pennsylvania, right? And this was like a kind of a problem that had to get sorted out. So within a few years, I think like 2 years, William Penn showed up here in 1683, I think. And then within a few years, he had to go straight back over to England to settle this dispute, because if he allowed Lord Baltimore to have his way and follow the king's edict that the 40th parallel would be the southern border of Pennsylvania, then William Penn stood to lose millions of acres of land across southern Pennsylvania. So he couldn't allow that to happen. I mean, that would have been a big slap in the face to him, and so he had to go back over and argue this in court before the king and before the British court. All right. All right, now look, William Penn went over to the courts. Yeah. William Penn went over to the courts in Britain and got into this big argument about the border, right? And here's the thing, I'm not going to go into all the details because it's like there are a lot of twists and turns, and I want to save some of that information for later in this series, because again, I'm trying to I think this is going to be the start of a series about the Mason Dixon Line, And honestly, I need to like draw some lines on maps to really explain it for you. And I just don't have time right now, so because it's Super Bowl weekend. But we'll get into that probably. So just to let you know, like we're gonna skip a little bit forward in the story because, long story short, the border dispute didn't really end with Penn and Lord Baltimore. I think they reached some sort of agreement, but it didn't really work. And so William Penn died, before this was resolved, and Lord Baltimore died before it was resolved. And of course, Lord Baltimore, his title went to his son, and William Penn left the colony of Pennsylvania to his sons, and William Penn's sons took over the border dispute and had a big argument with the new Lord Baltimore about this, and there was a big war. There were, people died. It was kind of an intense story. We're gonna go into all of this another time, but essentially, the Penn brothers, William Penn's sons, they started selling land along the border of Pennsylvania in order to like sort of by property rights assert their claim to the southern border of Pennsylvania, like. And Lord Baltimore started doing the same thing. There was some people he kind of got going. He sent them out there to buy all the land, and so he had this situation where, for a little while, William Penn the Penn brothers were selling land to the Penn brothers, and Lord Baltimore I think his name was Cressup, some guy, a land agent for Maryland. The two groups were selling the same plots of land back and forth. So, you'd buy a piece of land from a Quaker William Penn, from Pennsylvania. You'd buy a piece of land, and then the next day some guy would show up and sell the land that you just bought in Pennsylvania to someone in Maryland. Now you had a Maryland and a Pennsylvanian person fighting. And this was a big headache for the Penn brothers and for everybody in this part of the country. Now Delaware, I'm from Delaware County, and this series is important for Delaware County because the top of Delaware County, or I should say the southern border of Delaware County, is the northern border of the state of Delaware, where Delaware intersects with the Delaware River. And at the time, Delaware County and Delaware as a state was sort of grafted onto Pennsylvania. And it got caught up in this whole dispute. Delaware was used a bit of it as a pawn. And there's a good reason. If you look at the top of Delaware, the top border of the state is an arc. It's a curve. And that curve comes from, the reason that border is a circle, is a curve, comes from this land dispute where they were trying to figure out how do you let Delaware, how do you let what is Newcastle, or New Christiana, which Newcastle, Delaware, I think New Christiana became Wilmington, Delaware, right? So, back then it was called New Christiana, and in order to give someone who settled there, it's escaping me who took over New Christiana, someone who inherited it from the king, or maybe it was Lord Baltimore. He sent someone, I kind of forget. I should know that. But in any case, they wanted to give some land in a circle around Wilmington so that the guy who settled there, he could expand his borders without encroaching on Pennsylvania and Maryland. So they carved out this little arc, this circle on the map around Wilmington. And the northern border of that circle became what is now the border between Delaware State and Chester County, PA, which, the eastern bit of Chester County, PA is what became Delaware County. So that's how that's related to where I'm from. And I want to cover that also in this series. As you can tell, this whole back and forth between the Penn brothers and the Lord Baltimore, it was such a mess. It was crazy, and there were a lot of different maps and lots of different backs and forths, and I'll cover it. But the end result was they kind of realized they needed to figure out where the damn 40th parallel was. Like they actually needed a scientific person to show up and do a measurement. They couldn't rely on like John Smith from 1610 or random, settlers and colonists who were claiming like, no, I live in Pennsylvania, and then the neighbor would be like, no, I live in Maryland. And you can't settle border disputes that way. You need an actual measurement, right? So that is where Mason and Dixon come into the story. In order to settle the border dispute between Go Birds. In order to settle the border dispute, Go Birds, right? In order to settle the border dispute, the king found this guy in England who was one of the preeminent astronomers of his day, and then he found another guy who's one of the most well-known surveyors of his day, and that's Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. And here's a little fun fact for you that I don't know if this is true. Maybe someone can confirm or tell me if I'm spreading falsehoods. But I believe that Mason jars and Dixie cups are named after Mason and Dixon. I don't know why. That could be an old wives' tale. But I think, Mason jars and Dixie cups, they're named after them. And if someone knows why, I'd be interested to learn. So, any case. So the king got these guys to agree to come over and finally measure where the bottom of Pennsylvania actually existed, right? So, I guess at this point it would also be good to note that the reason the Mason Dixon Line, one of the reasons the Mason Dixon Line really mattered, I guess this border dispute is very obscure, right? So at the time that this was happening, I mean, it was absolutely something that in the colonies, it was a big problem. People knew about it. It wasn't like it was a nothing burger. It was definitely something. But the Mason-Dixon Line, when it was created, it didn't have yet the connotation that it took on later and all the meanings that it took on later during the Civil War. The Mason-Dixon Line is famous because it marks the divide between the South and the North. And this is more of it's a cultural divide. The culture of the South is pretty different from the North. And the southern, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular kind of sits at that crossroads between the North and the South. So Philly has like weird little touches of Southern culture, especially in Delaware. I don't know as much about Delaware, but I've heard in Wilmington that like Wilmington and Delaware and parts of Maryland start to feel like West Virginia and the South much more. And that's just 20 miles away down the Delaware. You sort of start to feel like you're in the South. So, it's Black History Month. So covering this line is very important for telling the story of slavery and telling the story of the Civil War. So, that's another reason why I want to tell this story, is that it's Black History Month and this story matters. And it really affected the culture of Philadelphia and who we are as a city. I mean, Go Birds, right? Like, this is where we come from. This is how this place, we're not part of Maryland. We're not Baltimore. We're Eagles people. We don't live down there. So but we could have been different if the Penn brothers had not settled that dispute the way they did. And if Mason and Dixon over, I might be a Marylander right now. Whoa, know. So that's why it matters. You know, that being said, you know, I don't think Mason and Dixon really knew that the line that they were drawing was going to take on such national importance and fame. And I don't even think they knew, I don't know if they knew that it would be called the Mason Dixon Line. I don't think they had any idea of what that story would become. But at the time, really their main interest was in settling this border dispute, and thankfully they did. But yeah, I guess so that sort of sets up the story generally. You know, John Smith came over 1610, made a bad map. The King of England doled out some land based on a bad map and caused a border dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland, with Delaware caught in the middle. And Mason and Dixon came over, and these guys were they were amazing scientists of their day. They were astronomers and looked at the stars, and they used the stars to set the Mason-Dixon line, right? And why do they use the stars? Like, because I just came from South Street. I mean, it's pretty clear there's a point right there where William Penn had set the bottom boundary of Philly. Why didn't they just use that as their starting spot, as dictated by the agreement, right? They could have just gone to the southern border of Philly and started from there, as the sign says they did. Well, it's a little complicated, as all things are in this story. And one of the problems with the agreement was they said, you know, okay, we'll start measuring the Mason-Dixon line from the southern border of Philly, which is at South Street, but you know, the city's going to expand over time, so they wanted to give a buffer zone to allow Philly to grow without growing into Maryland or into Delaware. And as a result, they realized they needed to give some mileage, right, on the southern border, some room for growth, and they decided, all right, 15 miles. Let's go with 15 miles. So we'll go to the southern border of Philly, and then from there we'll go 15 miles farther south and start the Mason-Dixon line there. All right, that's what they decided. But of course, if you know about Philly's geography, 15 miles south of South Street is just, it's like, I think it's in the middle of the Delaware River. There really isn't a way to start a survey 15 miles south of South Street. They couldn't do that. So what they did essentially was they started on South Street and they went 20 miles west out into the Pennsylvania countryside, and they then went 15 miles south from that point. All right, and when they got 15 miles south, that's where they started their survey. All right, I'm in Washington Square. Here's a little map. You can see this was Penn's plan for the city, right? And this line right here would have been the southern border, and that's basically where South Street is. Maybe South Street's actually off this map a little bit farther south, but it's sort of somewhere around here, right? And the city is laid out in a grid. That was William Penn's plan. I'm in this park right here. I'm in Washington Square Park. And then if you go down south a couple blocks, you hit South Street. And that's a little map of how Philly looked when Mason and Dixon showed up. So they were trying to measure from the southern point of Philly 15 miles south, and you see that you end up in the Delaware if you do that. Okay, we're coming to the end of the video, so I pretty much set up the story, gave you a quick overview of why the Mason-Dixon line exists and who Mason and Dixon, why they were brought over in the first place. And now I want to tell you a little bit about what the rest of this series is going to look like, because I'm in Philly, right? So, but I want to show you guys the border, and I love to hike. And when Mason and Dixon made their map, when they did their surveying, their work essentially involved hiking across Pennsylvania-Maryland border and measuring at each point on the map along the line. They put a little marker, and they put hundreds of these markers out there. There were I think at least 150, maybe even 200 markers. And these markers are essentially white stones. They're stones that were carved in England and brought over and placed along the southern border of Pennsylvania at every mile. So there's a mile marker stone in the woods along the southern border of Pennsylvania at every mile. And then every 5 miles they put a larger stone called a crown stone, which had the crest of the Penn family and then the Lord Baltimore's crest on the other side to really emphasize where the border was and who was on which lands these places belonged to. Now, this is kind of crazy because these stones were put out in the woods, and then many of them have just been forgotten. Like, they've been there for hundreds of years, 200 years in many cases, and they've just been forgotten. Like, a lot of them are still just in like random farmers' fields or just somewhere out in the woods somewhere. And I found in looking into this story, I found that there's a geological survey, the Maryland Geological Survey, that has taken it upon themselves to survey the stones and preserve them if they can. And so the Maryland Geological Survey is basically like a group of professional surveyors who have volunteered their time to go out in the woods and find these stones and mark them and basically make sure that they're in good state of preservation, and if they need to be preserved or salvaged in any way, they've been marking, basically collecting that information so they can come up with a plan and figure out what to do. And this is all public data. So I actually found their spreadsheet, and I emailed them, and I haven't heard back yet. But I found a spreadsheet that they made of every stone with each location across the border of Pennsylvania, and whether it's been found, whether it's missing, and that sort of information about the stones. And I want to maybe go help find some of the missing stones. I think this is something like, now let me wax poetic a little bit, wax philosophical, but I always say that we live in an ancient place. In America, we don't think of our land as very ancient compared to other places in the world. Like, hey, Future Sean here. I guess I was making a point about ancient rocks and the camera cut off, so it didn't get recorded, and I didn't realize it at the time. Because basically I was saying that we live in an ancient landscape, and one thing that I've learned about other places in the world is that ancient landscapes are covered in rocks. In the Stone Age, that's all they had. They had rocks and they had wood, and the wood didn't survive, it all decayed. So what's often left in these places, in ancient places, are just rocks. And we live in an ancient landscape here in Philly and in America on the East Coast, especially. A lot of the ancient places have been more or less destroyed, but some ancient rocks still are found out in the woods. And each civilization and each group of people that lives in these each group of people who lives in these ancient places, they used stone because in the Stone Age that's what they had, right? And the wood decayed. So each group left markings on stones, and in the future, archaeologists, when they dig things up, a lot of what they dig up are stones. And I've always just sort of thought about how in the future, if archaeologists are digging up these areas, they might find some Mason Dixon marker stones, and that'll be one of the things they find from our civilization in the future. It's just something to think about. Yeah, I'm just trying to say all the ancient places in the landscape, a lot of them, like rock outcroppings in the woods would have been known to the Native Americans, and the colonists would have learned about these places from the natives. But the colonists brought over their own stones, and I'm trying to draw this connection between ancient rocks and the Mason Dixon Line, because I think, you know, the Mason Dixon Line markers are our ancient stones in the woods from the time that Pennsylvania started and has colonized this land. They're part of that story, and a very important part. All right. All right, so here we are at Christ Church Burial Ground. And this is where I wanted to end this video. You know, I'm gonna do a series where I walk through the woods. I'm gonna try to hike and find some of these stones for you. But I wanted to show you one of them because I don't know if people know, you know, this is where Benjamin Franklin is buried, so, and there are a lot of famous people buried here. That, you know, it's the main reason why people come to this cemetery, is to see where Benjamin Franklin was buried and other famous people. And it's, you know, it's closed right now. I can't go up to it. I can't go inside, but I can still look. And if you look right over there, let me see if I can zoom in for you. That stone right there, that rectangular short little stone, and then that plaque in front of it, that is a Mason Dixon Line marker. And that is the grave of Mason himself. So when Mason died, whoever buried him recovered one of the stones, one of the original Mason Dixon Line marker stones, and put it on his grave as his headstone. Okay, so there you go. There's the first Mason Dixon Line marker of this series, and I want to find more Mason Dixon Line markers for you, so that we can have a little adventure and explore southern Pennsylvania border history. All right, and since we're here, we might as well check out Ben Franklin's grave, right? Ben Franklin is sort of the patron saint of Philadelphia in a way. Here he is. Oh, look at that. Someone put an Eagles cap on his grave. Go Birds, right? Go Birds! There you go. That's so funny. You know, this town has we have a lot of pride, so there it is. There's Ben Franklin's grave. And way back there, I don't know if we can still see it from this angle. Let's take a gander here. Can I see it? I'm trying to look through the bars to see if I can see the Mason Dixon marker, but I'm not sure. It might be behind that tree, I think. Oh no, maybe. Yeah, I think it's behind that tree. So, oh well. But there's Ben Franklin's grave on Super Bowl Sunday in Philadelphia. I think I'm feeling good. I have a good feeling about this game. Maybe I'll regret saying that. You know, I think I'm actually gonna quickly, before I finish this sentence, I don't want to finish this sentence before I find a tree that I can knock on wood, because I think that would be bad luck if I finish this sentence before knocking on wood, you know? Okay? I feel like I came very close for a moment there. I came very close to, you know, screwing up the mojo by speaking into existence the thing you're not supposed to say on game day. Hopefully knocking on wood erased any bad luck I just put out there accidentally. But I have a good feeling. I think, you know, again, this whole border dispute with Mason and Dixon, it comes down to measurement. And in Philly, we got to measure well today. We got to measure well. No more border disputes. All right, so let's learn from our mistakes of the past, and you know, let's measure well and score well and get her done, right? Yeah. So go Birds. This is again the first in the series, but I'll do more hikes through the woods next time. And you know, at the end of the series, we might come back and revisit that stone, and sort of finish off the story where it all began. We'll see. But this series is probably going to take me a couple months, and I have no schedule for it, so it's just going to be whenever I feel like going for a hike to find a stone. That's what I'll make a video at that point, but I don't have any, like, you know, idea of when I'll actually do that. And also, I'd love to hear from the Maryland Geological Survey. I reached out to them, and hopefully they'll contact me back and show, you know, because I'd like to contribute. I'd like to, when I'm hiking around and finding these stones, I might as well contribute to their survey. So if they you know, are interested in my help or whatever, you know, I'll maybe collaborate with them on this series if that makes any sense. So that could be a fun thing to do. And you know, I realized that this series is not necessarily exactly about Native American history, but it is about colonial history, and colonial history is Native American history. And so along the way, when I'm finding these stones, I'll try to also find Native American sites so that we can discuss, and you know, we'll cover some of the villages in the woods that are nearby where these marker stones are, and we'll cover some places. I think there were quite a few disputes with colonists. So the natives attacked, you know, Lenape attacked colonists and didn't want to get pushed out of their land, obviously. So there's some interesting little spots along the southern border of Pennsylvania where there were some native disputes with colonists that I might be able to cover. So, you know, we'll see as we go, but I'll try to keep the focus on, you know, I'll try to include Native American history as I'm focusing on colonial history. So. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of this video, you know, I appreciate you joining me for this series. You know, go birds! Happy, or you know, Black History Month. You know, and solidarity with the Native Americans. That's pretty much it, right? I think I covered all the bases. So yeah, I hope everybody has a happy Sunday. My name is Sean. This is my channel. It's all good, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.